Sorry. Ok.
Lijep pozdrav svima, mi ćemo lagano početi. Hvala vam na odazivu, lijepo mi da vas vidim sve ovdje na predavanju. Ja sam inače Ivana Selanec i zaposlenik sam Sinjskog ureda, Biomovog ureda, zato možda mi ste često viđali ovdje. I pošto nam je današnji predavač nije iz Hrvatske, podrijetlom je iz Amerike, ne priča hrvatski, tako će prezentacija se održati na engleskom jeziku. Ja ću se sad prebaciti ovom uvodnom riječi na engleski, da nemate ništa protiv. So, thank you dear friends and colleagues for coming tonight. Today I'm happy to introduce you Seth Wilson. We are at the moment having him and very happy to have him as a partner in the LIFE Lynx project. He also has now almost 20 years of experience working on large carnivore conservation. He was also involved and still is in LIFE BEAR project. That's partner with veterinary faculty in Croatia. And today he's going to talk about his experience in conservation and management of wolf in Montana. So it's quite important that you know that he, for the last 3 years, he's working in Slovenia. Also, he's involved in the large carnivore management in this part of Europe. But today we are going to talk about the Montana, not Croatia. I think we have a lot to learn about, and it will be very good for us to hear his story. I will also ask you to wait with questions and discussion after the presentation. So thank you very much, Seth.
Okay, great.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Can I stand like...
You could stand very...
How should I? Okay. Perfect. I'll just look over your shoulder. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Ivana, for the very kind introduction, and I want to thank BIOM for very kindly inviting me to Zagreb on this nice evening at the beginning of summer, it feels like. So, again, my name is Seth Wilson. I was born in New York City, raised just north of New York City, 2 hours in a small farming community in a very small state called Connecticut. And then I dispersed westward, as many people in the United States do. I felt the call of the wild, the call of the West. And as a young graduate student, I went to the University of Montana and received a master's degree and eventually a PhD, and then came back and did some postdoctoral research at the Yale University, the Yale School of Forestry. So today, as Ivana said, this evening, I'd like to talk about the conservation and management of wolves in Montana. And let's see if I can get this to go. Perfect. I think it's always nice to be geographically oriented. I love maps, and I know many of you in the audience as biologists and as professionals or hunters, maps are important. So we'll show a little bit of our geographic context. I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of wolves and some of those westward expansion and you know, some of that led to the exploitation of wolves and the loss of wolves in the West, and that led to the need for reintroduction in the 1995 and 96. I'll spend a little time just sharing our current management status of wolves, and then I'd like to end, and hopefully I'll have enough time to really focus on some of the preventative tools that we use to conserve and live with wolves. Okay. So, Montana is a large state located out here in the Rocky Mountain West of the United States. As you know, The U.S. is a big place. I thought if I could bring Croatia to Montana, we could have fun, but we can also just sort of get a sense of, you know, Croatia's roughly 56,000 square kilometers. And then if we were to bring Montana to this part of the world, it sort of just gives us a sense of the size of the place. Montana is 80,000 square kilometers larger than Italy. So it's a big place, and it's very sparsely populated, about 2.6 people per square kilometer. So we still don't have 1 million people living in Montana yet. We hope they stay away, because it's a very beautiful, wild place still. But if we go back in history, arguably two of our most famous explorers were Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Probably after Neil Armstrong, these two Americans are sort of our most famous explorers. And they were sent on an amazing journey by Thomas Jefferson, one of our early presidents in the United States, to find a route to the west, to the Pacific. And it's just really interesting. Historically, this wasn't for science. It wasn't necessarily in the name of just for exploration's sake. It was really to find an economic route to the Pacific. And this was done over the 2-year period of 1804, 1806. And you know, this was the United States at the time. This was still owned Louisiana. These were Spanish territories, and and most of this was still all in Native American, Northern Plains, and the Northwest Indian tribes. So if you've ever read about Lewis and Clark, it's a fascinating journey. They were very lucky they didn't die on this amazing trip. They saw thousands and thousands of bears on this trip. And they were lucky they probably were not eaten by bears, frankly. But that's another story. So why do I bring up the journey of Lewis and Clark? Because this opening of the West really led us to this idea of manifest destiny. And it became a justification for the railroads, the wagon trains, and people in wagons, settlers, many of course, Europeans, Croatians included, came to the new land of America to make a better life. I mean, you can see almost the whole history. This would be New York City, Manhattan. Here's the Brooklyn Bridge, you know. And people are going west. The bison, millions of bison are eventually eradicated. The Native Americans, you know, you can see them in fear. They're running away. So this is a very literal and figurative snapshot, a history of the United States of westward expansion. So I bring this up because some of the earliest settlers came for mining. They came for minerals like gold and silver and copper. As the miners settled the West, you had to feed the miners. And so thousands of livestock were trailed in to places, from places like Texas and the Ohio River Valley into many parts of the West, like California, and there's the gold rush. And you probably have seen interesting historical films about the gold rush in California, Nevada, Montana. So all of a sudden, the Native Americans are being eliminated, the wildlife is being eliminated, and mining and agriculture, as I said, hundreds of thousands of miners plus thousands of livestock equals this justification for westward expansion. And importantly, by having all these livestock moved into the western United States, carnivores like bears and wolves all of a sudden, you know, some of their food sources were eliminated. And so, of course, wolves as opportunistic carnivores will kill and eat livestock. And so this became a justification to eliminate large carnivores. But let's just start with the bison, for example. Bison were shot by the thousands from trains. The bison robe these beautiful coats were sold to Europeans, to European markets. Bones were used for fertilizer, if you can believe it. So if you just can imagine, the scale was real amazing at this time. Millions of bison are eliminated, and you eliminate the food source for the Northern Plains Indians. So this is a sad part of our history, but it's a real part of the history of the Western United States. Native people and wildlife are largely eliminated. Okay. Now, Montana, let's come back to Montana because we're talking about Montana tonight. In 1889, we were still a territory. Much of the state was still some of the state was controlled by different Native American tribes. So it's amazing. We didn't become a state till 1889. Just a little fun fact. I checked this on Wikipedia. Under the Austro-Hungarian rule, you were having parliamentary elections here in Zagreb in 1884. The same time, this is becoming a state. Just to think about the amazing differences in historical sort of periods where we move through. As I mentioned, this era of exploitation led to a commercialization and the destruction of wildlife, including wolves. These bounties were paid by both agricultural interests and the government. And so this happened from the 1880s all the way through the 1950s in the United States. And there were similar programs in Europe and other parts of the world to eliminate carnivores. By 1934, the last wolves were eliminated from Yellowstone National Park. And by the 1960s, only a few pockets of wolves remained in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota here. Maybe 200 to 300 wolves remained in the wild. Okay, luckily, I was born in 1970, so I'm giving out my age a little, but that's okay. I'm okay with that. Luckily, the 1970s were a progressive time in the United States and other parts of the world where environmental awareness became more common. We had some amazing legislation passed in the United States. For example, the Endangered Species Act is a piece of federal legislation that gave very good protection to species like wolves and bears. So wolves are protected in 1974. And if we, just a sec. So we have very few wolves left, but well, people had started thinking about wolf reintroduction as early as 1940. In fact, Aldo Leopold, one of our famous American ecologists who helped exterminate wolves, actually thought about reintroducing them, trying to make amends for some of the past as early as the 1940s. But it took, 30 years and much fighting and court battles to get the US government to officially decide to reintroduce wolves into Yellowstone Park in 1995 and in central Idaho in 1996. And they brought 31 wolves in from Canada for Yellowstone and 19 for Idaho. Now I lived through this period and I was a graduate student, and boy, it was a very contentious time in the western United States. The state of Idaho is completely opposed to having wolves back. The Nez Perce, which was really interesting, a native tribe, said that they would help with this reintroduction. So it was a very interesting time in the United States, in the West. But we got wolves reintroduced. Just a little story. This is Bruce Babbitt, the then Secretary of Interior. Western people are very proud. They don't like the federal government telling them what to do. It's, I think the analog would be the EU telling a rural Croatian villager or how to do something. In Slovenia, same thing. People don't always like a central authority telling someone what to do. So when you had the federal government directly involved in bringing wolves back in, it created a lot of sort of animosity between the states and the federal government, and that's still alive and well today. There was even a lot of discussion about the United Nations being involved in this, and it became, I don't know, Juro, if you remember discussions about a UN conspiracy, and there was talk in Montana and Idaho and Wyoming that the United Nations was flying around in black helicopters dropping wolves into Montana. So all these stories were going on, and so yeah, wow. It was interesting. Okay. After wolves were reintroduced, right here, 1995 and 96, you can see here, if we go into the triangles, the population in Montana has rebounded quite well. We've also had depredations on livestock, and I'll talk a bit about that. But generally, the biological response was quite amazing. If we look at some recent data, these are packs of wolves that are now well dispersed in this part of the United States. Today, there are probably, these were some of the earlier packs in Washington State. I think Washington State now has about 16 packs of wolves. Oregon has now 12. There are even wolves, if I could go off this, down here in Northern California. Wolves have been sighted down here in Utah. So there's been a real population expansion. Wolf pack sizes in Montana average about 500 square kilometers. Okay, I apologize for some of the text in this slide, but just so you can understand the current management of wolves today. Wolves are managed by the state, so they're no longer under the federal protection, the state of Montana. This agency, the state of Montana, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, does the day-to-day management. Wolves are hunted and trapped in Montana since 2009. We have a compensation program. This is the Montana Livestock Loss Board for damages when, say, a wolf kills a cow or a sheep. And then we have a prevention projects are carried out generally in different projects throughout the state, usually in collaboration among the state, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the NGO community has really pushed this prevention over the years. This is just to show some of the hunting data. You can see about 200 recently. 230, 206, 210, 246 wolves are hunted legally each year in Montana. Okay. Just so we can get, I went back to getting some of the most recent data I could. Today, the minimum known counts, these are aerial surveys that the state of Montana does. We have about 477 wolves, 109 packs. As I mentioned earlier, they're hunted and trapped in Montana. If we do a little, if we actually, these are minimum known numbers, but if you do some modeling using patch occupancy models, for example, in 2014, David Osband, one of the chief modelers in Montana, he estimated more like 892 wolves, because you really can't always count, you're never going to count all the wolves, even when you try diligently. Okay. So that's a bit of the history, our current management. I would like to talk now about some of the ways in which we live alongside wolves and try to prevent conflicts with wolves. And this is where I have worked. Some of my work has involved this area called the Blackfoot watershed, and again, just to give you those sort of vital statistics on the size of Montana, this watershed here in red is about 6,000 square kilometers. Project area is about 3,000, and I said earlier, very sparsely populated, which can be a good thing and also can be a challenging thing, but that's the overview. Again, just a sort of close-up. I thought I would show you a few pictures tonight of what this landscape looks like. It's typically quite mountainous in our large dolinas, large valleys with mountain ranges on either side. We get we have large rivers, wetland areas that's very productive for a range of wildlife. Just a few pictures of how the mountains will form, and then we have got these huge prairie grasslands in Montana. Here's a few images of Glacier National Park. This is my daughter several years ago. We've got bears. This is Yellowstone. And we also are producing many agricultural products in Montana. It's still, tourism is a big part of our economy, but it's still very much an agricultural based state. Sheep production, cattle production. Commonly we have very cold winters. So I guess you guys use the term livestock breeders. This would be, we would use the term rancher in Montana, but livestock breeders or ranchers typically have to produce hay, irrigated hay fields to feed their livestock during the winter. Montana also is like Croatia, honey production is an important part of our economy. We're the 4th largest honey producer in the United States. So honey is a big business. I wish I could talk about, if I had time, talk about bears and beehives. So there's a whole fascinating issues that we have in Montana with bears and bees, but I don't have time tonight. Just a few faces. This is a rancher I've come to know over the years. Just to give a human side to this. Working with a lovely guy named Jay Coughlin. He doesn't look so happy in the slide, but this is, these are tough Montana ranchers. When we think about wolves recolonizing a place like Montana, of course we're going to have some conflicts. And we shouldn't be surprised by this, but no one likes, particularly livestock breeders, certainly don't like losing their cattle to wolves. So we have the types of conflicts, undesirable damage to human property, mainly cattle and sheep. We have some domestic dogs being killed each year by wolves, but mainly our main conflict issue is with cattle and sheep. Okay. There are concerns by our hunting community, both perceived and actual. There have been some localized reductions in ungulate numbers, but I would just point out overall elk and deer numbers have remained high in Montana or at above desired levels. And so wolves have had some localized impacts. Overall, the ungulate population is doing very well. An interesting concern has been hunter opportunity and ungulate availability. As wolves have returned to parts of Montana, one interesting phenomena we've seen is that the bands of elk have become a bit smaller and more dispersed. That means it's harder to hunt those animals. So there's some spatial and temporal impacts wolves have had. And in the hunting community, that has been a concern. There's also been a political and symbolic conflict that has resulted with wolf reintroduction. One of my favorites is this. The wolf is the Saddam Hussein of the animal world. We don't want Saddam in Montana. And so we've had this polarizing conflict. You've got the people who love wolves, the people who hate wolves, the people who want to kill wolves. And we have the people who, this is, we see the whole spectrum. But in places like the Blackfoot Valley, to be realistic, there will be wolves that will die and there will be livestock that die. But in the middle of all this are people, and if you're willing to try to work on some of this, I think I'd like you to go home this evening with, if you could think of one message, and that is, it's hard work, but it's worth sitting down at the table with people who might be very different than you to try to work through some of these issues. And that's what we've done. And I will spend the rest of the evening talking a bit about some of the projects that we've used with a collaborative approach in the Blackfoot of Montana. So this is a just the watershed where we have worked. It's got 7 different communities. We've got a lot of cattle production down here. This is sort of like if you can think of a big bathtub. The rims of this bathtub are huge forested areas, and down in the bottom of the bathtub is agriculture. And so wolves are living throughout this whole landscape. We have tourism, we have some forestry, and as I said, we have largely the dominant land use is livestock breeding. Now, I had the great fortune to work closely with an existing non-governmental organization called the Blackfoot Challenge, and I worked as our wildlife committee coordinator for 12 years. And this is a landowner, I'll try not to do that. This is a landowner group, and the mission is to conserve and enhance the natural resources and the rural way of life in the watershed. Now, it's very important just to mention that this NGO has a very strong local membership. Livestock breeders, hunters, local businesses. This is really a proper grassroots effort, and it's really been a wonderful group of people for me to work with. And one way we've worked well together is through managing, now I know there's quite a bit of text here, but maybe if you could just let me explain this idea that we have communities of people who live in specific places. I know this may sound simple, but let's just take some European examples. These are places in Slovenia like Kučevje, Gorski Kotar in Croatia, Trentino, Kärnten in Austria. People live here and work there. And then we have communities of interest. We have the European Union. We have the capital cities of parts of Slovenia and Croatia. We've got interested people in Trento or in Vienna. And they have a lot of interest in carnivores. And I just bring this up because I've learned over the last 15, 20 years that we can't ignore people who live with carnivores, nor should we ignore people who have great interest in conserving carnivores. And so the key, the art, is trying to figure out how we can make decisions together. And I would argue that you might be surprised what you can achieve if you come, I like to call it the radical middle, where you can actually get radically improved outcomes. And I would argue that if you're attentive to both communities of place, communities of interest, and pay a particular attention to the value systems that each stakeholder group brings, then we can get work done. But many times we're ignoring each other. You know, the environmental community is ignoring the value system of the hunters or of the livestock breeders. The livestock breeders are ignoring the values of a passionate young biologist from Zagreb who wants to see more wolves in Croatia. How do we work this out? This takes time, and I think it's important that we try to do this approach when we talk about carnivores. I have found over the years that there are 4 important foundations if we were to bring a table and bring people around the table together. We need science. We need to be informed with, we need to at least agree on what is good science. And that's not an easy thing to do sometimes. But we should be informed with good science. We have to have some coordination of resources. As I mentioned, we want to think about those stakeholder values. And we need to have some sort of way to make decisions. And this whole table, this whole concept of working together relies on understanding both the ecological and social context. If we're down in southern Dalmatia, the ecological and social context will be different than in Istria or in Gorski Kotar, depending on what we're trying to tackle with respect to conservation. This is a sort of a conceptual framework that I've used to help, for me, that's helped me do my work. Okay, I'd like to now deepen some of the examples that we've put together in working together in a participatory way in Montana. So bringing people together, we start off with an idea that we should be inclusive, that everybody has an opportunity to be part of our decision making, to be part of our process. So this means bringing livestock breeders, hunters, NGOs, government ministries, university researchers, local people, and funders. And we do this it took us a lot of time to meet and to build this participatory process, but it was well worth it. You can see this has been 16 years in the making. Now I'd like to dive into some of our specific projects. I got started with this group and with this effort in the early 2000s. We were dealing with grizzly bear expansion back out onto private lands. We had a hunter killed by a bear. The community was extremely concerned about this. People were worried about their children. This is in 2001. The bear who killed the hunter was found and killed, and people were absolutely apoplectic, extremely angry about the situation. And as I said, people were worried about their children. We had bears causing conflicts, and we needed to do something. One of the things we did was I got involved using science, and this was a useful way to bring people together. I said, let's try to solve this problem. Let's understand why bears are coming to certain ranches. Why are we having conflicts in certain areas? And we did some spatial GIS mapping and modeling, and this helped us actually prepare for wolves that came after those 1995 and 1996 reintroductions. Wolves recolonized this part of Montana by 2006, and I'll try to tell that story here. So, in Montana, when you're running a livestock operation, it's not uncommon to have natural death loss. When mother cows give birth during this calving period, there's natural death loss. And we were mapping out in these squares, these areas where people were just depositing dead livestock, and this was drawing bears in. This is like saying, come into my VRBO here. We've got a vacancy. Come on in. Free room tonight. It's a great place, and there's free parking. Come on in. So the bears and the wolves were coming in, to these ranches, finding and using these boneyards, and causing additional conflicts. And this is an attractant as well for wolves. And we were documenting as early as 2006 and 2007, wolves were finding these same boneyards as well. So we wanted to get ahead of this problem. We worked with the community to co-generate data that was meaningful to the community, and they helped us build trust in our science and in our credibility. And so, I sat down with dozens of ranchers throughout this. It took me about 2 years to do this, and we mapped out all of these different kind of conflict hotspot attractant areas, and helped us do some modeling where we could prioritize conflict risk, and then actually use that to assign probability of conflicts. This is basically like an isopleth, like a predictive map that could help us understand, we need to do something in these sorts of areas because the probability is, extremely high. And so this was actually very helpful as a fundraising tool as well. I mean, let's be honest, if you're going to ask the foundation or the governments for money, it was very helpful to be able to say, we can prioritize where we want to focus our preventative projects in the landscape. So that was useful as well. Okay, so I mentioned this issue of bears and wolves coming into ranches to find dead livestock. We wanted to stop this, so we started removing carcasses on a very large scale. we started driving. We drive this truck around to ranches twice each week. We remove the carcasses, then we compost them. And this is a very effective and very cheap way to produce a really rich byproduct. The ranching community really liked this idea of not wasting the carcasses, recycling them. And we use it for roadside revegetation projects. These are just some examples of what we do. We're doing probably 1,000 animals per year right now in Montana. And we've got several new carcass management projects happening in other states as well. Washington, Alberta, modeled on some of our work in Montana. Okay. We needed to understand when we were dealing with wolves, how many wolves were starting to come back into our landscape. And, you can do some radio telemetry monitoring, but we asked the community to help us with winter wolf surveys. So this is just an interesting story that happened. When wolves started recolonizing our area, many livestock breeders told us we have 200 wolves, 300 wolves. So this is the talk you would hear in the bar if you go out to have a pivo. And we knew we don't have 200 wolves here. But what do you say? You can say, is it smart to call the livestock breeder? Is it smart to call them a liar or say, no way, you're just completely wrong? We said, okay, why don't you help us count wolves? And this was a very sort of clever way. We worked with the state of Montana. We brought volunteers together. So we would, every year, every winter, when we had good tracking conditions, we would bring the community together. We would go out on snowmobiles, on skis, and we would go out and assess and estimate the number of wolves we had. We would always end up at the local bar for more pivo, and we would share the results. And this was a very helpful way of actually, again, co-generating good information so that it was believed. And when ranchers started seeing, okay, this is sort of where wolf pack territory is, they were not, replicating counts again and again and again, if that makes sense. It really helped us see really the true number of wolves that were using the landscape. We've done a lot of electric fencing projects to help prevent wolves from killing livestock. These are just a few examples, some photographs of a typical fencing system. This is a fairly large one that protects calves during that vulnerable period when they're being born in the spring, that calving area when they're quite small. We've also used a type of visual deterrent electric fencing system. This is called fladry fencing. How many in this room are aware of fladry? Show of hands. Anyone has heard of this judo? Yeah, it's interesting. This came out of Europe, out of Poland and Russia, as a way to hunt wolves. By using these strands and this flagging, they would hunt wolves in Poland by creating sort of these funnels, driving the wolves in, catching them in nets, and then bludgeoning the wolves to death with clubs. Not a pretty sight, but back in late 1980s, early 1990s, a biologist in Idaho thought, well, maybe we could use this same concept to keep wolves from killing livestock. And so this type of fencing has got a little electric poly wire integrated in this plastic. And, this is pretty cool. This is one of the ranchers we work with. He designed and built his whole new system. And he sells these now to other ranchers as a way of deterring wolves from livestock. This is what it looks like when it's set up. You can set it up outside of your normal fencing system. And, ranchers are funny. He said, Jim Stone, he says, I want to make this as fast and as easy as possible. So, I'll just build this spooling system. He drives this thing around. We've set up 6, 7, 8 kilometers of this fence 2 to 3 hours. And so it's labor saving. When you're a livestock breeder, time is money. So this has been a nice innovation that's come by working, again, in this participatory manner. We use livestock guard dogs. We do a lot of range riding or more intensive livestock monitoring. So we're monitoring wolves that have radio collars. And so we can get a sense of how close wolves are to livestock. So we do this on horseback. Some of our range riders like to use motorcycles. I mean, they're Montanans, you know, so they like their motorcycles. But we do a lot of monitoring of livestock and wolves for 6 months of every season. This begins by a partnership. You have to have the livestock breeders involved. As I mentioned, we do monitoring and detection of wolves, tracking, we have camera trapping, we do radio tracking. We spend more time with livestock. This idea of more human presence. I mean, we've lost in many parts of the United States, we sort of lost our herd supervision, our husbandry, how to do this. We'll often kick out our livestock and we won't check on them for months at a time. Well, it's sort of, you know, we need to relearn some practices that, you know, many parts of the world actually do understand that you have to have a human presence with your livestock more often. This helps us with some avoidance and deterrence techniques. For example, when you know you have injured livestock, you can bring them home. You can get them, the veterinarian can go we can bring them out and have the veterinarian treat injured or sick cattle so they're not as vulnerable to livestock, to wolves. So these are some very nice and simple ways of helping to prevent conflicts. It's also really interesting when we have our range riders out checking on the livestock. In Montana, the livestock are brought back to the home ranches in October and they're counted and then they're shipped off to the markets. But it's been very helpful to have our range riders assisting with that roundup and gathering and actually seeing the numbers of livestock that have been that have died from natural causes. So we have lightning that kill livestock. Sometimes livestock simply just die from plant poisonings. They might get stuck in bogs or they get mired into some wet areas. And our range riders have really helped shift the blame off of wolves. Wolves were being blamed for all of these deaths when in fact they were just natural causes. And this created a lot more trust with the ranching community to actually get a better idea of what was really happening out in the landscape. Okay. One of the most important parts of this whole cycle of having hired range riders out there in the communities, in with the livestock, has been more communication. We produce on our website, again, this is the NGO, the Blackfoot Challenge that I worked with. We created a wolf report every 2 weeks. We would provide information on pack sizes, distribution, which wolf packs have radio collars. This was very helpful for the ranching community to feel like they were being treated equally with the information that the scientists had and that the livestock community had. Okay, so we put all of these projects together. The encouraging trend, and I'm not going to stand up here and claim causation, but the encouraging trend that we're seeing is that wolves came back into our project area around 2006, 2007. The numbers have increased quickly. We have in 2005, 2015, 2016, we have about 12 packs of wolves. The good news is that the number of livestock losses have been very low. We have about 16,000 livestock in our project area. When you average out the annual loss to wolves, it's about 2.3 livestock per year. Extremely low. And we've had to remove about three wolves per year for those depredations. And so if these numbers were following this trend, if conflicts and removing wolves, then we would have really failed. But this is an encouraging step forward in my estimation. Just a sort of a quick fun fact. As of 2016, there were about 100 wolves, over 10 packs, living primarily in Yellowstone National Park. So we're outside of Yellowstone, and we have about half the number of wolves, and we're having very few conflicts. And so this is a working landscape. And so I'm hopeful, that we can demonstrate that it is possible to live with wolves. When we look at some other data sets, when we look across the whole state of Montana, and we actually look at chronic or counts of depredations, in areas where we have higher depredation rates, you can see some of these hunting districts in Montana. This is our area where we've been working in the Blackfoot Valley for the last 10 years on this. And so when we it's interesting, this area is very close to, it's almost like a quasi-replicate in terms of experimental design. This area has very similar land use practices, very similar ecological conditions, but literally no coexistence, no preventative projects going on. And so we see conflicts occurring in these sort of landscapes, very similar to ours, year after year, similar situations in these areas. And there's some ecological differences down here. But this is encouraging to me that when we look at longer data sets, that we are hopefully having a positive impact for people and for wolves. So I'll finish with a few practical lessons that we've learned. We started by bringing our community together during the day. This was a mistake. Ranchers are busy, people are busy with their jobs, and they weren't attending our meetings. Those of us in the NGO community, this is our job. But we have to remember, people are busy. So we started holding our meetings in the evening. We provided food. And this was actually a small, simple, practical way of actually bringing people together to talk in a non-threatening small group situation. We hosted many, many field tours over the years. Again, provide food. This should be hopefully applicable in Europe. I know Europeans, Croatians, you guys love good food. So it's a little technique we've used in Montana. Tours help us see the different tools that were available. It helped us really foster, again, these small group discussions with the different stakeholders. We hired local people. Conservation can create jobs, and jobs are good. Politicians like this when conservationists create new jobs. We hired local people. We hired local teachers. It was really nice to have local people who were in our projects write about this in the local press. These are just some little examples of some practical lessons we learned. When local people are speaking positively about it, it really can permeate into the rest of the fabric and help us do our job more easily. We were very lucky that our livestock breeders were willing to travel within Montana to other states, Washington, Oregon, California, Alberta, to talk at a peer-to-peer level. One of my fondest memories is when 40 Canadian ranchers showed up in the Blackfoot with about 20 cases of beer. We roasted a pig, and we talked about how to live with bears and wolves for 2.5, 3 days. And they went back to Alberta, and they've replicated many of the projects. And so, rancher to rancher communication has been essential. This has been very helpful in terms of positive outcomes in the press. Some of the largest press in the United States has taken notice of some of our work. After years of conflict, a new dynamic in wolf country. And it's just really important that, we stay out. When I say we, I've tended to avoid, wanting the spotlight on myself with this sort of work. Dean Peterson is a 4th-generation rancher. Much better to let the ranchers tell this story than a scientist. There's a time for that, but often it's a lot more powerful in terms of communication strategies to have the local people share their stories and feel very proud of what they've accomplished. National Geographic covered our work. Again, we really focused, if you go to this issue in National Geographic, it's a lot of fun. There's ranchers are throughout the whole issue in this one article. We reached 34 million listeners through our national public radio, one of our largest radio news programs in the United States. And again, Montana and ranchers really were the focus of our story. So we stepped back, let the ranchers tell the story. We've created some films. And as I mentioned earlier, this rancher-to-rancher or peer-to-peer learning has really enjoyed further transferability and scalability to other parts of Montana, Wyoming. We've been working over here in Washington State, Oregon, even California. I just put this slide together. And I'll just conclude. And again, I know this slide has a lot of text in it, but I will just quickly try to walk through it. So when we think about how we work with local people and how we would like to have long-term recovery and sustainability of carnivore populations, I look at this as a gradient. You can, and if you think about the form of local involvement and what you get, you can sort of let it just go. You know, you can tell people you're on your own, and we've seen what happens in history, I think. People will eliminate carnivores. You can tell people, but I think you have fairly low odds of success. And I'm not going to name names of any of the NGOs, but in the United States, we have lots of big, huge, fancy, very wealthy NGOs just telling people how they should do it. Please, 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 can you learn to live with wolves? Here's a booklet. Here's a brochure on how to do it. This doesn't work. You can tell people how, but it just doesn't work. We still have problems losing carnivores. Now, I'm guilty of this. You know, I look back and be self-critical on the work that I've tried to work on over the years. We're a bit in this gradient here, hopefully moving to this peer education model. But we have had to do some of this, and this is sort of this dependency model. You can have successful programs, but it's expensive, and it may not be long-term and sustainable. You can show people how this is this technology transfer model. That's better. But the ideal is when you have a sort of ownership peer education model where coexistence becomes part of the local culture, it becomes normalized. And this is the rancher-to-rancher, hunter-to-hunter, peer-to-peer approach so we can live with carnivores. And I think I'll just stop and not worry about that pyramid. And I just want to thank all of my funders and partners. And again, thank you to BIOM for having me here this evening. And with that, we can certainly have any questions you might have. I know it's hot in here, and you want to go, and that's okay. Please, question.
My question is, your hunters import livestock, wild livestock for killing if they don't have enough animals to kill in that area.
Maybe.
Could you please repeat all the questions?
Yeah.
If you don't mind, because
Okay. Can you, and maybe just, can you repeat the question so I'm clear on it? I'm just not sure I understood it.
Do your hunters
Okay.
import stock for hunting when they do not have enough stock to hunt?
Okay, the question is, if, say, ungulates or populations go down, do our hunters bring in new animals? So that's your question? Typically, no. The state may do reintroductions. For example, bighorn sheep populations have fluctuated in Montana, but hunters typically no. They live with the ups and downs.
So do they feed the wild animals?
No. Not in Montana. Now, different states do allow some feeding. Texas does allow some feeding, but in Montana, we have laws that forbid the feeding of ungulates. And yeah. Juro.
Yeah, I would like to go to this natural trade with domestic animals you explained so nicely. And you mentioned that actually there was no visible effect, or there was no problem like the previous question was, that the natural trade didn't go down prey because of the wolves, but still hunters were kind of concerned. Can you tell a little bit more, and how do you try to mitigate that? The concern of hunters that they have less game for their hunting because of wolves.
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. How do we mitigate against that perception that wolves are reducing opportunities for hunting? You know, I think you simply have to work a little harder. I mean, in certain places it means the phenomenon I said earlier, we saw in certain places where elk were in larger bands. Elk were in larger numbers and in larger groups. That's easier to hunt, okay? With the reintroduction of wolves and the population recovery of wolves, elk have become much more wary. Bands have become smaller. Interestingly, many livestock breeders actually, in private, will tell me that they actually like the way wolves have moved the way wolves have moved elk around on their properties because it's improving the grass. They're not hitting, the grass is not being grazed and overbrowsed. But you know, I think some hunters have accepted it. They've accepted the fact that, you know, it's not quite as easy to kill elk, but overall the numbers have been very good. We're still at above or remain we're still at all the quotas that people want, the hunting community wants. So I don't think it's been.
Is there any request for maybe compensation of hunters for the loss of their game? What we face here in Europe often, and the other thing, this cooling of wolves, or killing some wolves, it's only to have less damages on livestock, I guess. Or is it also because of the influence on the rate?
Okay, a couple questions there. Have hunters requested compensation? No, not in Montana. It's mainly been the livestock community and we have a compensation program. We pay full market value for confirmed losses and for probable losses. So we have a full sort of safety net now. Yeah.
And wolf control, shooting wolves is only to reduce the damage on livestock, I guess.
Correct. Yes, you can. It's legal now to kill a wolf. If you're a livestock breeder, you can kill a wolf if you determine, and it's subjective, but if that wolf is found to be in the act of threatening or attacking livestock. You can't just shoot a wolf. If a wolf walks across your driveway, it's not looking like it's threatening your livestock, you cannot simply kill that wolf. So there's some trust involved in this, right?
Last question, is
Sure.
Shooting of wolves some part of trophy hunting? I mean, does anybody get some money from hunting wolves? Like trophy hunting?
I mean, certainly there are trophy hunters in Montana who are hunting wolves to put their, to have them mounted in their homes. So yeah, people are trophy hunting for sure.
Is there any business in this hunting of wolves?
I don't believe you're allowed to sell those trophies for like commercial.
A permit to hunt. It's not something.
No.
Like hunting trophy animal in Europe is a big business.
Yeah, I mean you can buy a Montana license and at a low cost. Yeah.
Cheap.
Yeah, it's very cheap. It's like $25, 25 euros or something. Yeah. Yeah. So it's not put the wolves in this, high price trophy concept. Yeah. Other questions? Sure.
Are there any places in the U.S. where introduction of wolves take place, except this in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming?
Yeah, there's been some work in parts of New Mexico and Arizona. Yeah, and in the southeast, and in places like Carolina with the red wolf. Yeah.
And what about their program of management of wolves?
Yeah. Well, it varies.
Most successful of
Well, this has been, it's been more difficult in the southeast for sure, and then in New Mexico and Arizona, it's a much smaller wolf population there, and that's still ongoing, and it's still controversial. I'd have to go look at the data, but I think, you know, there's between 50 and 80 wolves in that part of Arizona and New Mexico. This has been the biggest success story in my understanding in terms of wolf reintroduction in the United States. I mean, the habitat was so good, and there were so many ungulates, you know. So the wolves have done very well, yeah. So one other, oh, Ivana, sure.
So you mentioned tourism.
Mm-hmm.
Is wildlife watching.
Yeah. Yes.
Tourism developed, and does the farmers, local farmers and hunters, are they involved in that?
Oh, that's a great question. So the question Ivana poses is, with the idea of wolf watching, are hunters and or livestock breeders taking part in this? Very little still. I think there's a lot of opportunity for this. The bulk of our tourism we see is from Yellowstone wolf viewing. I mean, Yellowstone is getting about 4 to 4.5 million annual visits per year. And I think if you look at some of the survey research, the recreational survey research, one of the #1 reasons people are visiting Yellowstone National Park is the hope to see a wolf. So it's big business. I mean, wolves do bring millions of dollars into those gateway, we call them gateway communities, Bozeman, Jackson, Wyoming. But I think your question is a good one. Can we somehow shift the idea of wolves as economic liability to an economic asset for a hunter or for a livestock breeder? We've thought about this with our range rider program. We thought about, could we get, you know, people love horses, you know, Californians, people in Kentucky. Could we get people to come and pay for a tour to ride horseback, maybe see a wolf, see a Montana ranch in action, sort of ecotourism? Come help us. Yeah, it's a market that's maybe out there. You know, I think this whole idea of wildlife viewing, carnivore, soft tourism, soft nature, ecotourism is hopefully a part of the future. Yeah, there's a lot to do. Please.
Were there any other failed attempts at introducing wolves in this manner so that the community is a part of it? Or is this the first one and the first one to succeed?
Okay. The question is, are there examples of failed situations where wolves have been brought in but the community doesn't respond? For sure, yes. I mean, we worked very hard in this particular part of Montana. There are other communities that have not done very much at all, and so we have lots of conflicts there. Does that answer your question? With those reintroduced wolves, yeah, absolutely. So,
and what do you think is the main problem? The lack of communication or something else?
well, sometimes it's lack of capacity. Montana is a big state, and we have limited resources, and so the environmental community, we can't be in all of these places. I wish we could, you know, and that takes communication. It takes money. Our project here, we spend on average about 85,000 euros per year to run all of those programs. The fencing, the range riding, the carcass removal, the monitoring. But we can't, you know, we don't, unfortunately, our prevention program at the state level in Montana, we have about 200,000 euros a year to disperse, you know, into the whole state. So it's a question of capacity and dollars, euros. That's a great question. I wish we could scale up all over, but it's a long-term. To live with carnivores is a long-term endeavor, and it takes patience, time, money, capacity.
So, in other words, if you don't have the money,
Perhaps not.
But this is why it seems this peer-to-peer exchanges is something that could then grow out with limited resources. You can maybe achieve peer-to-peer success.
This was, you know, this was a dream. I mean, what we've done here together was a dream for me, you know, 15 years ago when we had no idea whether it would be successful or not. But you have to, I mean, hopefully you can start with a prototype and it can spread. But you need, it takes leadership from the livestock breeders, it takes help from our hunting community, it takes scientists, NGOs working together, having supportive politicians, you know. But, you know, I think it's okay to start at a small scale, because if you can't demonstrate success, you won't really get very far, right? So it's okay to start small, and hopefully it can grow. Yeah. Oh, sure, please.
Where are the wolves you bring to Montana from?
I'm sorry, yeah, where are the wolves? Where were they from? And I'm sorry if I didn't cover that. I mentioned it just briefly. They were from Canada. Yeah. 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 Wolves, you know, it's interesting. Wolves are actually coming in naturally before this whole push by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it was called the Magic Pack. The Magic Pack showed up west of Glacier National Park in like 1984. So wolves were starting to come in naturally, slowly, slowly. And it would have been interesting if we hadn't reintroduced them, you know? Just to think about, okay, what would have happened if we had allowed wolves just to naturally recolonize? Would social acceptance have been different? I don't know. But anyway, sir, I digress. Okay. Oh, cool. Please.
And what about the education of young generation? Do you have any effort there?
We do, and I didn't really spend much time on it tonight. We could probably do more. The next generation of youth is absolutely important. We go into the local schools in our local communities, probably once or twice per year. But we could do more. We've focused on the adult decision makers. That was sort of our strategic decision, to focus on that. The people who really were controlling the decisions on the landscape for this work. But I think you make a very good point. You know, what happens with the next generation takes over. Absolutely.
Because you have to ask yourself, what about 20 years from now?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I agree. Come help us. Please, yeah. Yeah. So, are you hot? Oh, please.
A few questions.
Great.
So I will ask you first, because I understand the law to actually, in Montana, you legally shooting per year 230 to 260 wolves. My first question, as I understand the law,
Yes.
you're shooting 230 to 260 wolves.
It's roughly.
Legally.
Yeah, the question is, are we the hunting harvest in Montana is about, it's over 200 wolves per year.
Okay.
Yeah.
189. Okay.
200, 240, depends. We can go look at, I can share the data. It's about 30%, the population wolf, thank you for coming. It's about 25 to 30% of the population per year.
Okay. And you say now you have 477 wolves on 109
Packs. Yep.
So it's very nice. And you say on the beginning Montana is 380,000 square kilometers.
Big, yeah.
And Croatia is 56.
Yes, yes.
And in Croatia actually only 1/3 of our country is suitable for wolf. So what do you think in Croatia is real number what we can compensate between We do not have rangers, but we have our people who using the land and cattle. They have cattle. So we start after 23 of year of the war again cattle on the Lake area.
Okay.
So how many wolves actually you think so we can have on 25,000 square meter?
You know, I would be probably foolish to guess at that without, you know, consulting the best available data that you have in Croatia in terms of what the wolf population looks like. From just an outside perspective, it seems to me that it would be nice to see more consensus around around the data, around the science, around the numbers of wolves. And I don't know the Croatian situation. I know that there's some polarization and there's some lack of trust among hunters, among scientists, among NGOs. One idea as an outside person just looking in without a vested interest. I mean, I care about wolves, of course. I also care about hunters. I care about livestock breeders. I care about the NGO community. I'm a person who likes to work through a consensus process. So when I just look into the situation in Croatia, I see opportunity for hunters and livestock breeders and scientists and the NGO community to come together in a genuine, rational framework and actually figure out a agreed upon way to count and monitor wolves. This might be a good step if people could agree here. What is the wolf population actually doing? Is it decreasing? Is it stable? Is it increasing? I don't know. This is just an idea.
Okay, can I ask you something more?
Sure.
How many types of deers you have in Montana?
Well, we have what we call elk, Cervus. We have the elk. We have white-tailed deer. We have mule deer. We have a type of antelope, pronghorn antelope species. But mostly preferred prey by wolves are elk. We have moose, but fairly small population of moose. I mean, we have...
you have a bigger number of moose before this so big population of moose?
I'd have to look at the data. Wolves, grizzly bear like to eat moose calves. But we've never had a very large moose population even before wolves. Montana's quite dry. It's a pretty dry state compared to parts of Canada where the moose population is much, much greater.
But in your experience,
yes.
You can tell in Montana,
sure.
in your area, what do you think so it's really one possible number per hectares or square kilometers? How many numbers of wolves you see in the future is correct? Because I see you shooting them 200, you're shooting 25% of population, what is very normal for local, I see. Because you have a lot of deer, different deer, food for them. And you say one thing, you're not feeding your animals in Montana.
Right.
Can we go back on picture where you have a lot of green grass where you actually provide for your cattle and stay on open land? So do you think your moose and elk and all these guys don't know to eat that? As you're feeding them because you need to feed the cattle.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you bring up an important issue. We have probably more direct damage from elk to livestock forage than we have from wolves.
So actually the forest guys like the wolves a lot and bears.
But it's also interesting, you know, we've had some of our livestock breeders tell me, I'm happy to have wolves back in Montana because they do a much better job reducing the elk numbers than any hunter can. Yeah. So it's interesting, you know, the wolves are doing their job, actually reducing the population of elk in certain places that produces more grass for cattle. I mean, there's a lot of other ecological benefits that we've seen from wolf reintroduction, from riparian biodiversity in our riparian areas in Yellowstone. It's been amazing. With beavers have returned to Yellowstone. There's this whole trophic cascade hypothesis that we could talk about. We don't have time tonight, but wolves. You have beavers. You have more dams on the rivers. You actually have more groundwater infiltration going into the groundwater. You actually have more irrigation water in certain cases for the ranching community, and you can make somewhat of an argument that wolves have helped facilitate that. So it's a complicated, interconnected system. So.
Somebody not help?
Sure.
So I can I ask you, because we have the interest to know how the United States, actually Montana, working with these wolves.
Okay.
Who paid the cattle? State, I see.
Okay, who pays for, now the question, so for our damages, yeah. Yes. I sit on the, I'm appointed by our governor, and I'm a board member for our Montana Livestock Loss Board, and so we pay for verified and probable losses from wolves. When wolves kill livestock, we pay. We have a compensation program. Yes.
And please, can you tell me, does it have each price for it? Does it have, I mean, same price for each cow, or you have different things? Does you have, example, one price for nice wool, or one for cattle,
yeah,
or old cow?
Yes.
Young cow?
Yeah.
Yes.
We have a different scale. It depends on the market value during that week. So we use real-time economic data to estimate the value of, say, a bull versus a steer versus a 3-year-old productive heifer, yeah. So we're using real-time economic data based on the best market value for that.
So it's very fair if you're looking on your...
It's very fair, and we also typically make our payment claim within 2 weeks.
How many?
2 weeks.
For 2 weeks you pay it?
We try to. That's our...
I think so you are very late. If we compare our country,
so,
you have 2 years.
But yeah, and I think timely payments, if you look at global compensation payment schemes, this can be a disaster if you're paying it takes a long time, and this can be a huge problem. So, yeah.
You can in Montana 2.65 person per square kilometer.
Yeah.
In the area we have 1.12 person per square kilometer. For example, one municipality.
Yeah, okay.
Who is cattle. So do you think so your people who arise the cattle, does they are lucky they are paid 14 days, or they are paid after 2 years, what's happened here in Croatia? So you can imagine here, one person who loses bull, and then he waiting 2 years, or he loses 100 sheep, or 200 sheep in one night,
yeah.
and then he waiting 2 years, or 1 year. So you understand?
I understand.
You understand how big problem is, because the state not understand why the hate is so big against wolves. If we have the state like that, but we are only 23 years after war, honestly. So
yeah.
And the European Union, we expect they want to be zoo, that they like to come in here to be a touristic destination to show him the bear, wolf, and lynx. So can we have something from the EU? Does you think so? To it be right to be asking EU for some compensation?
I mean, from what you're telling me, it certainly seems like the compensation program could be improved in terms of paying payments in a timely manner. I mean, if that's true, if it takes 1 to 2 years for people to be paid, that could be, I see that as very problematic. Maybe this is something that could be improved through some sort of stakeholder process.
But Montana held the state government, how I understand.
The state.
United States of America.
No, it's just our state government.
Yeah, okay. But does another states help you on this project?
No, the project that I've shown tonight has been, you know, it's a mixture. We have, okay, are you asking me how we fund this? How we pay for it, or are you asking about compensation?
No, I asked you,
Sorry, yeah.
United States,
Yeah.
does United States is involved in the project, not like only newspaper and radio, does they are involved by money?
We have received, each year it's always a struggle to find funding for our work. So we've had some support from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but these are grants we have to write, so we might, some of our grants, one year we were able to get 75,000 euros, and we use this for a couple of years. We get money from private foundations, the state of Montana, individual ranchers. I mean, this livestock carcass removal program, the ranching community is putting 2,000 to 3,000 euros in each year. So it's a combination. It's a constant, one of my jobs was trying to find the money, the funding for this year after year after year. And it's, we take money from both state, federal, private sources to make it work. Yeah. So it takes hard work and creativity to do that, yeah. As many of you know in the NGO community. Yeah.
So I think so even if we are part of union, the union needs to help.
Well,
Only 4 million people.
I would agree.
I don't know how many Montana have people.
We have about 900,000 people. We don't, not even 1 million yet. Yeah. So.
Sorry, I have to ask you to finish tonight because of the hours. So
Okay.
please
Thank
join
you.
us.
Thank you very much.
After. Yeah. Thank you, Seth.
You're welcome.